Hello YouTube! Welcome to my first ever video on 18th century history, hopefully one of a series. First, I apologise if the audio quality varies a bit, and please note this is designed as more of a podcast, although there are some pictures to keep you entertained if watching. Today, I will be running through a timetable for an English gentry family during the Regency period. The kind of family we've seen in Jane Austen novels, for instance the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice. Decide to say this is a very generalised timetable. It does very much vary from household to household. And in future videos I intend to look at different kinds of families. For instance, the next video will be running through a timetable for an average day in an aristocratic household. But back to our Bennet family. We would expect them to wake sometime between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, definitely more like 8 o'clock in winter, as the sun rises slightly later in winter. The servants would have been up for around 2 hours before, in order to prepare things such as fires, water for washing, not for bathing, I'd just like to point out. It's more of a kind of rub down. So you have a bowl of water, definitely wash your face and hands, and if you have time you probably take something a bit like a flannel and just give yourself a quick wash before dressing. The time between waking and breakfast was spent, as I've just mentioned, dressing, but also for the women of the household, letter writing, practicing music or other accomplishments, or perhaps going for a walk close to the home. They might also, if they have the money, choose to go for a ride. The men of the household might spend their time similarly. They're much more likely to be out taking an early morning walk, or going for a ride, or trying to have an early breakfast if they have activities planned for the day, which mean they need to leave the house slightly earlier than they might otherwise do. They have quite a leisurely breakfast from around 10 o'clock. Again, this does vary. Taking Pride and Prejudice as our example, we know that Elizabeth Bennet leaves after finishing her breakfast, and then she arrives at Netherfield after walking 3 miles, approximately an hour's walk, as they are still in the middle of breakfast. So just in that same novel, in the same confined geographical area, the time for breakfast does vary. Breakfast would look a bit more like a continental breakfast that we have today. It's generally served buffet style, perhaps in a breakfast or morning room. If you are particularly wealthy, it would definitely be a breakfast room, but the majority of households would have it in the morning room, a sitting room, a drawing room, or perhaps the dining room. It kind of ends up wherever you have space. Tea, coffee and chocolate would be laid out, along with rolls, cheese, usually some kind of cakes, and perhaps even ale. After finishing breakfast, men and women generally part for the day. The post will usually arrive during breakfast, including the day's papers, as well as correspondence with the head of a household and the lady of the house, and any daughters or sons. One of the first duties of the day for the lady of the house after breakfast would be to consult with a housekeeper, cook, or maid. So you might do this before breakfast, but generally they do wait until after breakfast, and they'll be looking forward to the day ahead and also planning for the week. Men, they generally tend to retire to their library or study, particularly if they are married, to conduct estate business. We know, for instance, that Mr. Bennet spends much of his time in the library, probably more than is good for him. And he will spend his time there dealing with accounts, dealing with correspondence to do with the business, and his business being the family home, the family estate, and making sure that the agricultural produce is actually productive and that any tenants or workers are happy and working to capacity, as well as kind of reinvesting in the estate. But he will retire to the library. He will, as a Regency gentleman, and he is very much a gentleman, try and keep abreast of the news of the day and deal with any correspondence, normally business. Other kinds of letters, family letters, tend to be written to women, and so after consulting with her housekeeper, cook or maid, the lady of the house will generally retire to deal with any urgent correspondence, and the younger daughters of the household might do similarly. A lot of a lady's morning will be spent letter writing, or if you are unmarried, practicing your accomplishments. And this period continues until around 1 o'clock. So in between waking and breakfast, which can be between 3 and 2 hours, and between the end of breakfast and the beginning of the sociable hours, usually around 2 hours, women would spend their time practicing piano, perhaps reading improving books, singing, practicing their dancing, drawing, painting, perhaps going for a ride or going for a walk, practicing their foreign languages, or sewing. The kind of sewing that you would do during this time could vary. You might be doing plain sewing, which has a lot more to do with dressmaking and practical purposes, or fine work, which is embroidery, cross-stitch, the pretty things that you like to display. From around 1, after dressing again for the afternoon, women might go visiting, or they might be at home to receive visitors. The Bennet family being a country family, the visiting hours and also the practice of visiting is relatively informal. We know that the Bennet daughters do go and visit their aunt in the town, and they do this during the sociable visiting hours between 1 and 3, and they just drop in and call. But these are the only visits of this kind that we see in the novel. The majority of visits seem to be upon invitation. But between 1 and 3, if keeping home hours, you are at home and anyone can come and call on you. For instance, Mrs. Bennet would have a calling card, and on it she would say that she is at home on a Tuesday between 1 and 3. She might well have her daughters, or at least some of her daughters, on this card, and which would mean that they would be expected to be there as well. And their various neighbours will come and call between these hours, usually staying for around 15 minutes to half an hour, keeping the bonnet on, and then leaving to go and call upon the next family. If you were beginning to call around 4 o'clock, you would have to know the person you were visiting extremely well, as you would be under suspicion of angling for a dinner invitation. During the visiting hours of 1 and 3, you might well serve a light meal. Lunch is a meal which has started to creep in. It's a very feminine meal, generally served at home during the visiting hours, and it consists of perhaps sandwiches, but small cakes, fruit, scones, along with some light wine and some tea. You don't have to spend every day visiting. You might well go shopping if there is a local kind of place to go shopping. For instance, we know that Meryton has at least one shop which is visited by the Bennet sisters. You might go on a ride or walk, generally something sociable, so you won't be doing this alone. You might go for a ride alone in the morning, but certainly during between 1 and 3 p.m. you're generally doing something in company with others, whether your own family, another family, or someone of the opposite sex. Varies greatly. From around 5 p.m, most families will retire to dress, particularly gentry families, as they want to be seen as fashionable and have a fashionably late dinner hour. Dinner at this period had been moving gradually later, so an average gentry family might well dine at 6. The latest dinner hour mentioned in any Jane Austen novel is 8 p.m. in The Watsons. And we know that Jane Austen herself, at the beginning of her life, ate dinner at 3:30. So this is around 1780. She would have dinner at 3:30, but this did move. So by the time she was living in Southampton, she was dining at 5. Dinner, if served purely to the family, could be quite a quick affair, perhaps just 1 hour. And after that, the women would remove and go to a withdrawing room, the drawing room. There, tea would be served, and conversation or other evening entertainments will be the thing of the day until retiring to bed. Mr. Bennet, he will stay at the dinner table, perhaps to drink some wine or some port, and then usually would be expected to join the ladies. If it is a dinner party, this could last between 4 and 5 hours, depending on the number of guests and also the number of removes. A remove being a bit like a course in a dinner today, except everything is laid out on the table at the same time, and you just have more or less of these depending on the formality of and the fashionability of your dinner. But generally speaking, we have 5 p.m. retiring to dress, around 6 p.m. beginning of dinner, then somewhere between 7 and potentially 10 p.m. dinner finishing, and some kind of tea being served. If you are a slightly poorer family, you might actually have an earlier dinner hour, perhaps the 3:30 that Jane Austen had, and then a supper around 10 or 11 p.m. just to tide you over until retiring to bed. It's very hard to tell because it's quite a personal thing, but we think that most people on an average day would retire to bed around midnight. But in between the end of dinner and retiring, you would hopefully spend time with your family or with your guests, listening or playing music, perhaps reading aloud, either a popular novel, perhaps some poetry, or even something like Shakespeare. And you could do this in quite a theatrical fashion, with different people reading the different parts. You might play games. We know, for instance, that Skittles was something that could be enjoyed indoors, though usually you needed quite a large house. You might play cards. There are various card games from the 18th century that I might go into detail on in a future video. Or you would spend your time in conversation. Conversation being one of the most important activities of the 18th century. Thank you for listening today. I'm hoping to get up a video every 2 weeks. The next one, as I have said, should be on a day in the life of an 18th century aristocrat. You all know how YouTube works, so please like and subscribe, and I will be back in 2 weeks. Bye!